Welcome to the second vodcast for the Hebrews course. This one's on the audience of Hebrews. We know pretty much as little about the audience of Hebrews as we know about the author. We might know a little bit more, although here you have the added complication that we're hearing about the audience and we're inferring about the audience through the eyes of the author. Now, frankly, I think there's probably I assume that the author understands what the audience is going through pretty accurately. We could get into a fine little theological discussion about inspiration. Doesn't inspiration require that the author understand the audience exactly and that write appropriately to the audience? Is it enough to say that an author under inspiration writes something that is true, or does the author have to truly connect with the audience? We won't get off into that kind of a theological discussion. But anyway, we want to ask what we can infer with varying degrees of certainty about the audience from the book of Hebrews. So let's dig right into it. The first question we want to ask is, where were they likely located? Now here there is actually somewhat of a majority opinion of those scholars who have argued that Hebrews is written to a specific place. Most of them think that Hebrews was written to, well, let's wait a second. Let's look at the evidence and see if you can get there before I get there. The main verse is, "Those from Italy greet you." In Hebrews 13:24, the author is making some closing remarks, and he says, "Those from Italy greet you." Now, he's telling the audience that those from Italy greet them. What does this mean? Does this mean that there's some Italians near him? You know how those Italians are. They greet you. Hugh Montefiore suggested that the Italians that he refers to are Priscilla and Aquila, and that, in fact, Hugh Montefiore is a good example of getting a little too far with your speculation. He thought that Hebrews is written by Apollos, in the kitchen with the pipe wrench. Apollos wrote to Corinth. Priscilla and Aquila, the Italians, yada yada yada. I think he said written from Ephesus. Just way too much speculation. And of course, if you read Hebrews through that lens, then either this is the best commentary ever written because he happens to have gotten it right, or it's horrible commentary bound to mislead you because he's made far too many speculations. Anyway, those Italians greet you. That's a possibility. Those from Italy, they're here with me. They greet you. That's one possibility. Another possibility is those from Italy greet you. Those here with me from Italy greet you wherever I'm writing to. This would be another possibility. I think it was Jewett, wasn't it, who argued that Hebrews was written to the Lycus Valley. You know how Colossians in the Lycus Valley has some stuff about angels worshiping, or worshiping angels, the way he took it. And Hebrews has some talking about Christ being greater than the angels. So he suggested that perhaps, Bob Jewett suggested that perhaps Hebrews was written to the Lycus Valley. But the majority position, that is, of those scholars who take a position on where Hebrews was written to, most take the interpretation that the author is saying those away from Italy greet those of you who are back in Italy. And the strongest argument here is the preposition for from. The preposition for from here is apo, which normally has the sense of being away from. Again, words aren't that consistent, but more likely than not, the more likely than not interpretation is that the author is saying that those away from Italy greet you, and then it would make sense that he was writing back to Italy. None of this is definite, knockdown, drag out. In fact, maybe we have just gotten too comfortable with the idea that it was written to Rome. Did you guess it? You get there before me? Of those commentators who have made a judgment as to where Hebrews was written, the majority position is that it was written to Rome. Again, the evidence is pretty tentative, but that is the one that most commentators currently would suggest. And we can come up with some other arguments for this. It is the most likely Christian location for there to be Christians in Italy. We know of there being Christians in Italy. We know of there being Christians in Italy before Paul is even in Corinth, apparently. When Paul gets to Corinth, he finds Priscilla and Aquila, who have been expelled from Rome. And this expulsion from Rome that took place around the year AD 49 took place under the Emperor Claudius. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because of arguments they were having over Christus. Now, it's possible that this is a reference to Christ. It's not a done deal, but most historians, I think, have concluded that this is a reference to Christ. There were Christian Jews in Rome who were arguing with non-believing Jews in Rome over whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, and it was creating such a conflict that Claudius either expels all Jews or expels Christian Jews. My hunch is that he expels Christian Jews because it's going to be hard to expel. There were a lot of Jews in Rome. That's possible. Tiberius expelled the Jews from Rome many years, decades earlier. Anyway, so we know that there were Christians in Rome from a very early time, even before Paul really was thick of his second missionary journey. And so that is the most likely location, as far as we know, for Christians to be in Rome. Also, it's a place where we know there to have been persecution of Christians. As we'll see in a few minutes, this audience of Hebrews has undergone persecution in the past. And we know of at least two major persecutions of Christians in Rome in the mid-first century. We know, first of all, the one I just mentioned in the year AD 49, where Christians were expelled, Christian Jews were expelled from Rome. I might add that would have left a largely Gentile Christian population in Rome for the next decade or so. That may become significant a little bit later on. So there was a persecution in AD 49. And there was also persecution we know of in AD 64, 65. You may know that Rome burned in around the year 64, and people blamed Nero for it, the emperor at that time. They blamed him because it was all too convenient for some building projects that he then embarked on after parts of Rome had been destroyed by fire. Now, actually, most secular historians don't think that Nero had anything to do with this fire. He was actually out of town at the time, and so that whole myth of him playing the fiddle while Rome burned is not true at all. That part is definitely not true. But it is not at all clear that he set this fire. I mean, of course, you can have people set fires when you're not in town. You establish an alibi. But he hadn't seen any CSI or anything like that, so probably he wasn't quite that smart. Could have been. Anyway, people were blaming Nero for this fire. So he got out his Rolodex of people that nobody likes. And he saw, Christians, nobody likes these people. And so he blamed the fire on Christians. And he thought, hey, we're going to persecute people. Let's have fun with this. He invented, some new ways to kill people. Hey, let's put animal skins on them and let the dogs go wild, or I'll pretend I'm Zeus, in a chariot, and we'll throw spears, we'll light my garden. Let's set them on fire. Have better parties at night. Probably not. But anyway, so Nero persecuted Christians in 64. So these are possible references to Hebrews when it talks about prior persecutions the community has undergone. We don't really know of the kinds of persecutions that Hebrews talks about in other places in the ancient world. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. We don't know a lot. But it makes Rome, given what we do know, the most likely option. And just to put the nail in the coffin, or not really, is the fact that Clement of Rome is the first place that we find an allusion to Hebrews. Clement of Rome was surprisingly from Rome. And according to tradition, he wrote in the late 90s from Rome, which would imply that knowledge of Hebrews had gotten there. Now, actually, I hate to say it, but we can't be as certain about the dating of Clement, First Clement, as previous generations were. The traditional dating was that it was written in 96, not long after the death of Domitian. But we really don't know that for sure. First Clement could have been written in the early 2nd century, for all we know. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and say it was written in the 90s. And so it makes sense that the place where we first hear about Hebrews would be a location where Hebrews was written to. It was around. So it's not a proof. None of that's a proof. But it does make Rome a perfectly logical suggestion for the audience, where the audience of Hebrews is located. So what else can we say about this audience? Well, we can say that they were second-generation Christians. Remember what we said about the author? in relation to Hebrews 2:3. Don't neglect this great salvation, which was first spoken by the Lord and confirmed to us by those who heard him. Those who heard him. The audience, like the author, are in a group who has heard those who heard Jesus. We don't know who it was that founded the churches at Rome, but somebody did, and those who did were apparently those who had heard the Lord, some of their leaders. So the audience are second generation Christians. They have been Christians for some time, as Hebrews 5:12 indicates. You should be teachers by now. You've been Christians long enough to be teachers. To be sure, there is some shaming going on here, as David de Silva points out. Their situation may not be quite as drastic as these words make them sound out. Kind of, the author eventually will say, "I'm convinced of better things than this." So he's kind of holding a big stick over them. But surely there's some kernel of truth here. You should be teachers by now. You've been Christians long enough. You should be teachers. So they've been Christians for a while. What else can we say about them? They had previously endured suffering, and I have already mentioned this. Here's Hebrews 10:32 through 34. The author is basically saying, come on, you guys can keep going. Remember the former days after you were enlightened, during which you endured an intense contest of sufferings. You were publicly disgraced. People insulted you. You were persecuted. You suffered along with those who were being insulted and persecuted. You suffered together with prisoners, and you took with joy the seizing of your possessions. And this could refer to Peter and Paul being prisoners. That's pure speculation. We can't say with any probability who these people were. In fact, I think it more likely that these were their former leaders who had died for their faith. Hebrews 13:7. Remember your leaders who spoke to you the word of God. Look on the outcome of their conduct and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. You know that verse, 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And of course, that's true no matter how you skin it. You can make it a memory verse, you can put it on a little card, put it on a bumper sticker. It's true as a memory verse, but it's also true that in this context, probably what the author is saying is Jesus was there for your leaders when they suffered. He's there for you now when you're suffering, and he'll be there whenever you suffer until the whole thing, is set right. So it seems to me more likely than not that the leaders of this community had been martyred for their faith. Not all agree with me. So, for example, William Lane believes that the verse Hebrews 2:3, I believe it is, you have not yet come to the point of shedding blood in your resistance against sin. William Lane and others take this to mean that the audience has not yet had anybody die in suffering for their faith. I think that really that's reading too much into the verse. That really the verse is simply saying that you've not died yet for your faith in this current situation. So you can keep going. It doesn't necessarily mean that nobody in their context had ever died in the past. I don't think that necessarily follows. But the word outcome here, ekbasis, the going out, it seems to me most likely refers to the death, the end of the life of the leaders of the community. So, see, William Lane thinks that the prior persecution was in AD 49 with Priscilla and Aquila being kicked out of Rome. I think that the form of persecution is in the time of Nero, more likely. So, what else can we infer as we read between the lines? Well, obviously, it's a Greek-speaking audience. Duh. I mean, they wouldn't be able to read the letter, or they're probably not reading it. We should think of them as an audience rather than readers, because this is an oral world. We should picture someone standing up in front of them and reading this as a sermon to the congregation, in my opinion. This, by the way, the Greek of it seems to work against some of the hypotheses that came out, in the decades after the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. You know how it is, new discovery, everybody tries to apply that grid on all the old data, try to read all the data again with the Dead Sea Scrolls now in view. And so you had a number of scholars in the 60s who tested out a Dead Sea hypothesis. You had Kosmala, you had Speke, you had F.F. Bruce, Richard Longenecker. All of these individuals tried to apply an Essene connection to Hebrews. And of course, Philo does mention a group in Egypt. He calls the Therapeutai, who were Essene-like, but obviously, I think probably would have been Greek speakers. So um, it's not impossible, but these hypotheses, I think traditionally it was thought that Hebrews might have been written to Rome, to Jerusalem. But all of these theories that the audience of Hebrews were priests, somehow maybe connected with the Dead Sea or that community there, I think tend to fail on the language barrier. Now, again, we shouldn't, it would be wrong to assume that there was no Greek speaking in Palestine. That has definitively been shown to be false. There was much Greek speaking in Palestine. And Greek and Palestine had been Hellenized for hundreds of years before Christ came. So it's not that it couldn't have been written in Palestine. It's just if we're going to go on where the more likely audience is, it's far more likely that the audience of Hebrews is some diaspora or Mediterranean type setting rather than Jerusalem or Palestine. So it's a Greek speaking audience. Were they Jews? There we get back to the question. You remember, if you watched the previous podcast, that I went psycho at the suggestion that the author of Hebrews had to be Jewish because there's so much Old Testament stuff, so much Jewish stuff in Hebrews. The author must have been Jewish. Although I do think the author was Jewish, the author doesn't have to be Jewish, in my opinion. It goes the same with the audience. There's a lot of Jewish stuff here. And it's true. First Thessalonians doesn't have any quotations of the Old Testament written to a Gentile community. However, I think there are a number of assumptions we need to be very careful about when it comes to just presuming that the audience of Hebrews had to be Jewish. And in fact, I'm going to argue that the audience of Hebrews was probably primarily Gentile. Let's see what I can come up with here and whether I can convince you of that. So let's examine some assumptions. First of all, Hebrews, when it uses language of the audience becoming Christians, it uses language that would be most appropriate in relation to Gentile conversion. I'm not making an absolute argument here by any means, but I want to make it clear that let me step back and talk about this word conversion. It is appropriate to speak of a Jew converting from one form of Judaism to another. But when we use the word conversion, we are all too likely to think of Judaism and Christianity as two different religions. And a Jew who becomes a Christian is converting to a different religion from Christianity. Those lenses, I believe, are highly inappropriate lenses for reading the New Testament. And so when Hebrews talks about becoming enlightened, it is impossible those who have become enlightened. That is language that is most appropriate in relationship to Gentiles becoming Christians. It is somewhat odd language to use in relation to Jews becoming Christians. I'm not saying that it can't be used. I'm simply saying that we probably don't realize our assumptions there. This language of ignorance or of being in the dark, these sorts of things, or of not knowing the living God, this is language that Jews used about Gentiles. Remember Acts 17, where Paul is talking to the Athenians, and he says, in times of your ignorance God winked at, but now he commands everyone to repent. In other words, you Gentiles, you ignorant Gentiles who did not know the true God. Think of Romans 1. Even though they should have known God, they didn't know God or glorify him as God, but their foolish hearts were darkened. Having professed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for a glory like to corruptible man and four-footed beasts, and in so many words, idolatry, worship not the living God, but they turned to dead idols, as First Thessalonians talks about how its audience turned away from dead idols. So this language of enlightenment, here's another one. Remember the former days after you were enlightened. This language of enlightenment is most often used of Gentiles coming to recognize the Jewish God, not a turning from a Jewish religion to Christian religion, but a turning from Gentile paganism and ignorance of the true God to the living God, knowing the true God. Now, could this language be used of Jews who don't believe on Jesus as the Christ? Well, sure it could. In fact, Paul turns some language on its head like that in Philippians, where he calls, beware of the dogs, and here takes a Gentile term that Jews used in reference to Gentiles and use it to refer to Jews. And he talks about how certain Jews are uncircumcised of heart. So it's not impossible. I'm making a cumulative argument here. Some other assumptions. Into the second tent, that is, in the Holy of Holies, the high priest alone went once a year for the sins of ignorance of the people. Sins of ignorance. Again, this verse is referring to everybody, both Jew and Gentile. But notice that, by the way, I should mention that Hebrews nowhere uses the term Judaios, Jew, or ethnos, Gentile. Hebrews doesn't argue Jew, Gentile. Hebrews considers all humans who have confessed Christ to be of the seed of Abraham. So there's none of this argument we find in Paul about Jews and Gentiles. There is the assumption that both Jew and Gentile are in the seed of Abraham, which seems to point to a time, or at least an audience, where this is not in debate. I think it tips it a little bit toward a Gentile audience, in the sense that you might need to argue to a Jewish audience that Gentiles are just as much seed of Abraham. The author of Hebrews doesn't argue at all that both Jew and Gentile are in the seed. Bit of a tangent. I don't have a bullet for you, I'm sorry. But this reference to sins committed in ignorance is more appropriate, or would have been more appropriate for a Jew to use, as we've seen, in terms of a Gentile rather than a Jew. Again, this idea that when the audience came to Christ, when they confessed Christ, they came to a knowledge of the truth. All of this is language that could be used of Jews believing on Jesus as the Messiah, but it is most appropriate in a context where Gentiles are coming to believe on the true God. 3:12. This is a James Moffat long ago argued, one of the few English commentators to argue for a Gentile audience of Hebrews primarily. I mean, I hope you understand, I'm not saying there were no Jews in the audience. That'd be silly. How would we know that? But I'm arguing for a sermon that primarily targets a Gentile audience. Look at this. Watch that, so that none of you has a heart of unbelief to turn from the living God. Again, this is the rhetoric that Jews used in relation to Gentiles who served dead idols. You need to turn to the living God, away from dead idols. Here's the clincher for me. I used to think that, and you know how I am, I used to think, oh, you'd have to be stupid not to think that the audience of Hebrews was Jewish. Well, I had to eat a little personal crow when I came to the conclusion, you know what? Actually, my problem is my assumptions, that I haven't examined my assumptions. This is the verse that really changed my mind, and as I read through De Silva's commentary, Perseverance and Gratitude, who, by the way, doesn't argue for a completely Gentile audience, ironically. But this was the verse in his comments that led me to think that, well, maybe the audience is, in fact, primarily Gentile. Therefore, leaving the beginning word about the Christ, let us bring it on. Let us bring on perfection. Let's not lay again the foundation of repentance from dead works, faith in God, teaching of baptisms and the laying on of hands, of the resurrection of dead, and of eternal judgment. Now, it's long been noted, Attridge notes this, many note this, that there is nothing really that is specifically Christian, or at least not that much that is distinctively Christian in this. So, for example, and notice that the foundation, he's talking about the foundation, the beginning word about the Christ. This is stuff that that we should equate with the time when the audience becomes enlightened, when the audience comes to the knowledge of the truth. This is the point of conversion foundation stuff. This is Christian foundation for the audience. The problem here is that if the audience is Jewish, then this is not foundation that they would have gained when they became Christians. Let me try to make it clear. These are things that the audience apparently learned when they became Christians. But if the audience is Jewish, they would not have learned these things when they became Christians, because these are Jewish beliefs for the most part. And so these these teachings are most appropriate things for people to learn when, if they were Gentiles becoming Christian Jews. And let me point out that that's probably the best way to refer to the early Christians. It is much more accurate, in my opinion, to refer to Paul and Peter as Christian Jews than it is to refer to them as Jewish Christians, simply because to call them Jewish Christians plays into all our assumptions about Christianity being a different religion at that time from Judaism. These Gentiles saw themselves as converting to Judaism. Christian Judaism, yes, but that's what they saw themselves converting to, not to some religion, Christianity, that was distinct from Judaism. So let's look at these. Repentance from dead works. Jews believed in that. That's not foundation that would be laid when they believed in the Christ. Faith in God. All Jews believe in faith in God. That is not a foundation laid at the beginning word about the Christ. Faith in God is something Jews learned from the earliest day. Teaching of baptisms and laying on of hands. Now there, I've not put that in bold because that is something that I think probably was distinctively Christian. But the resurrection of the dead is not. Now, not all Jews believed in the resurrection of the dead, but many Jews did. That is a Jewish belief. And so the belief in the resurrection of the dead is not clearly something that a Jew would learn when becoming a Christian, something a Jew probably would have known forever. It is something, however, that a Gentile would need to learn when becoming a Christian Jew. And then, of course, teaching of eternal judgment. So there is very little here that would support this as foundation that a Jew would learn when becoming a Christian. However, everything here is stuff that a Gentile would need to learn when the foundation of the beginning word about the Christ was being added on. So, I've already done all this, but this is foundation stuff. Are these really things that Jews would have learned when they became Christians? Are these things that they had need to teach you the beginning elements of the oracles of God all over again? No, I don't think they are. I think that this is a blind spot in Anglo-American English-speaking commentators. The majority of English-speaking commentators, it's a little different in the German commentators, but the majority of Anglo-American commentators say that the audience is Jewish. I believe that this is because of certain blind spots. It is based on the false assumption that the early Christians saw Christian faith as different from Jewish faith. We just assume that because the things here in 6:1 and 2 are Christian, that they're not Jewish. Well, obviously they are Jewish. Secondly, there is an assumption that Gentile believers were liberal like Paul in relation to the law and the Jerusalem cultus. Cultus here means the sacrificial system. Here we have to, this is a blind spot we need to correct. There were very, very likely Christian Gentiles who were more law observant than Paul, or more conscious of the importance of the law than Paul would have them be. And here I refer to an early church father, Ambrosiaster, who said that the church at Rome had affinities with Jerusalem Christianity. You know, the Roman Catholic Church tradition argues that Peter was the first pope, the first bishop of Rome, or the founder of the Church of Rome. Very few Roman Catholic scholars that I am aware of actually believe that Peter founded the Church at Rome. But there probably is a kernel of truth here, namely that the Church at Rome was more likely, a bit more like Petrine Christianity than it was like Pauline Christianity. What I'm suggesting is that the churches at Rome were probably more conservative than Paul's churches were. And this is, of course, Ambrosiaster's claim plays into this. There's a book by Raymond Brown and John Meyer, I believe it is, called Antioch in Rome that argues this. It's a good little book. I think probably the primary reason why the idea of a primarily Gentile audience hasn't caught on is the difficulty of working out a situation in which Gentile believers would have a faith crisis in relation to the Levitical cultus in regard to the sacrificial system. And it'll take a whole nother vodcast for me to explore what I think the situation of Hebrews exactly is to account for exactly what kind of a situation might have fit the bill of what we're talking about here. So this ends the second vodcast on the audience of Hebrews.